the spill that shook the cabin. The splash came without warning, and the cold, sticky rush of Coca-Cola hit Naomi's chest like a slap from the sky, shocking her nerves and silencing her breath for one frozen second before the gasps started echoing around her like little explosions of disbelief. Some passengers clutched their armrests, while others twisted in their seats trying to see what had just happened, but no one moved to intervene. No one even breathed too loudly as the scene unfolded. Like a nightmare stitched in real time, right in the plush luxury of business class, Naomi sat motionless, staring straight ahead with the soft rustle of the plane's airflow humming in her ears and the scent of sugar and soda and insult clinging to her expensive white silk blouse. Her trembling hands reached for the napkin on her tray table as the cold liquid dripped down into the folds of her lap, soaking the edge of her skirt and pooling into her seat cushion. She didn't look back, not yet, not at the girl behind her who had thrown the drink. She didn't need to. She had already caught the reflection in the small black screen in front of her, the reflection of a smirking teenage girl, a pale face lit by mischief and cruelty, and surrounded by the glow of cell phone screens held up like trophies by the other teens. It wasn't an accident that much was clear. The laughter that followed was sharp and mean, like broken glass in her ears, and Naomi slowly began to dab at her blouse, trying to keep her hands steady, while her heart pounded like it wanted to burst free of her chest. The soda had already stained through the fabric and left a visible trail, and she felt a raw heat creeping up her throat, not from shame, but from the kind of humiliation that burns and curls deep inside the chest, threatening to erupt at any second. And she knew this feeling too well. It was the same one she had felt in other boardrooms at other events where she had been the only black woman. In a sea of white faces, the same feeling when someone would assume she was staff, not a guest, or worse, when they would pretend she wasn't there at Allah. Male passenger behind her leaned forward, his voice low and measured and full of compassion, as he said, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Nobody should be treated like this on a flight, or anywhere else for that matter." And she turned her head just slightly to acknowledge him with a nod, not trusting herself to speak yet. The flight attendant still hadn't reacted properly. The lead attendant, a woman in her late 40s with tightly pulled hair and a plastic smile, finally approached and said with a nervous chuckle, "Kids these days, am I right? Just a silly prank. Nothing serious." And Naomi looked up at her, and in a voice as calm as polished steel, she said, "If it had been bleach, would you still call it silly?" The attendant blinked and faltered and looked around as if hoping someone else would come take over the conversation. Another flight attendant, a younger man with an anxious expression and a name tag that said Ben, came forward and mumbled something to the lead, who then backed off quickly, leaving Naomi there soaked in Coca-Cola and silence. The teenage girl who had thrown the drink didn't say a word, but Naomi could still hear her chuckling quietly to her friends, taking another selfie while gesturing toward her as if she were nothing more than entertainment. Naomi didn't rise to the bait. She didn't curse or scream or even glare. She simply pulled out her phone, opened her messaging app, and sent a short text to the only person she knew would understand, without explanation. It happened 2 minutes later. Her phone vibrated with a reply, him handling it. "Stay calm." That was all she needed to read her husband, Alexander Jackson, a name not many people in this cabin would recognize immediately, but a name that carried the weight of billions, a name that owned more companies than the average person could count on both hands, including the airline she was currently sitting on. Naomi's fingers tightened around the phone, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. The crew offered her a small stack of paper towels, but didn't escort the teenager to economy, didn't reprimand her, didn't even issue a proper apology. Instead, they continued walking up and down the aisle, serving drinks and snacks, as if nothing had happened, as if Naomi's drenched blouse and ruined seat didn't mean a thing. The man across from her, a white gentleman in a tan suit, muttered, disgraceful, under his breath, shaking his head, while a young Latino couple in the row behind her looked visibly uncomfortable, whispering to each other about how wrong this was. Yet nobody moved to confront the girl or the crew. The captain never came out from the cockpit, and Naomi knew they wouldn't, not for her, not unless someone forced their hand. She wiped her hands clean and sat tall and still, her presence steady and unshaken despite the cold clinging to her clothes. She wasn't just enduring this, she was remembering every detail, cataloging every response, and making sure every insult was recorded, not on her phone but in her mind. When the landing announcement came and the plane began its descent into Miami International, the girl behind her leaned forward and whispered loudly enough for her friends to hear, Wonder if Soda comes out of silk laughing again, and Naomi remained silent. But her eyes were locked on the seat in front of her, unblinking and calm, because she knew something. The girl did I justice sometimes takes time, but it always lands, eventually as. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign went off. The passengers began gathering their belongings, ready to disembark, but just as people began to stand, a sharp voice came over the intercom. Passengers, please remain seated for a few moments. Airport staff will be boarding shortly for a special protocol. Thank you for your cooperation. The cabin filled with confused murmurs and annoyed sighs, but Naomi didn't move. She simply smoothed her skirt and zipped up her small designer bag, waiting patiently as the plane door opened and 3 sharply dressed airline supervisors stepped inside, their faces serious and their eyes scanning the rows like laser beams. Behind them came 4 uniformed security officers, one holding a clipboard. Good afternoon passengers, we are conducting an immediate review of a reported in-flight incident and ask for your cooperation at this time, said the lead officer. The girl in row 16, who had thrown the drink, now looked a bit less amused, especially when the officer turned directly to Naomi and said, Mrs. Jackson, we sincerely apologize for what occurred. Please allow us to escort you off first for your statement and comfort the flight attendant. Tried to object but was silenced by a firm look from one of the supervisors, who said, this matter is under executive review, ma'am, please step aside. Naomi stood, slowly and calmly gathering her bag and walking past the stunned teenagers, who now sat rigid and confused. One of them asked aloud, what's going on? Why is she getting special treatment? Naomi turned to her and said softly, because my husband owns your future. And then she walked down the aisle with a quiet grace and power that silenced the entire front half of the cabin. At the end of the jet bridge, a small team waited for her, men and women in suits, holding tablets and folders with the logo of Aero Global Holdings discreetly embroidered on their badges. They greeted her with quiet professionalism, while an assistant draped a jacket over her shoulders and another handed her warm cloth to clean her hands. She didn't ask questions and she didn't smile. She simply nodded and said thank you, and stepped forward as the airport team guided her to a private lounge where a legal advisor was already waiting, alongside a communications manager and a brand reputation officer. Meanwhile, back inside the plane, the rest of the passengers were finally allowed to disembark, but not before the teenage girl and her friends were stopped at the exit by 2 security officers and asked to remain for questioning. Their phones were requested as part of the incident report, and their faces went pale by the time Naomi sat down in the lounge and accepted a glass of water. Her husband had already made 6 calls, 1 to the CEO of the airline, 1 to the head of global HR, 1 to the VP of customer operations, and 3 to his legal team. By morning a storm was going to hit this airline, and it wasn't going to be easy to recover from, because what happened to Naomi wasn't just a spill. It wasn't just a prank. It wasn't just racism. It was a direct insult to a woman who had earned every seat she ever sat in, a woman who built bridges across industries, mentored hundreds, and carried herself with dignity through decades of silent battles. And now it was her turn to stop being silent. She looked at the communications manager and said, clearly, I want the crew investigated. I want the passenger's identity logged, and I want the recordings collected within 24 hours, and I want every department to know that I am not angry, I am disappointed, and I will not accept the same corporate apologies that we've heard 1,000 times before. The manager nodded and took notes. Quickly Naomi leaned back and finally allowed herself to breathe, because she knew one thing for sure: this time there would be consequences. They would start before sunrise. His phone did not stop ringing the moment Alexander Jackson ended the call with his wife. He didn't pace, he didn't yell, he didn't even blink. He simply turned in his chair at the top floor of the Jackson Global Tower overlooking the skyline and said to his assistant, "Get me the CEO of STY Airlines now, and make sure he knows I am not in the mood for delay." His voice was smooth but sharp like the edge of a scalpel, and the assistant immediately nodded and stepped out of the office, phone pressed to his ear. Within 3 minutes the call came through, and the airline CEO Richard Vellman sounded far too casual as he greeted Alexander with a forced smile in his tone. "Alexander, I didn't expect to hear from you today. How's the golf retreat?" There was no golf, no retreat, and no trace of patience left in Alexander's chest. He replied, "My wife just landed in Miami with Coca-Cola soaked into a white silk blouse thrown at her by a teen girl in business class, while your staff stood around like mannequins and did Absolutely nothing. There was a pause, then a stutter, then the beginning of a weak explanation. Didn't let him finish. You will identify every crew member involved, every passenger. Near row 16 and every piece of footage captured on that aircraft. I want it compiled tonight, and I want every single one of them off duty by some. Tried to recover, but Mr. Jackson, we have a protocol and a disciplinary own 47% of your parent company. Richard, your protocol is my protocol, and today it failed, and when my protocols fail, people lose their jobs. Silence fell across the line. Alexander leaned back in his chair and pulled up a secure live feed from the Miami lounge where Naomi was calmly speaking to legal counsel, her posture still poised, her face composed, but he knew that look. She was tired, not from the flight, but from the same war she had fought her entire life, and this time the war had followed her 30,000 feet into the sky outside. His office, more assistants had gathered, whispering as news started to leak that something was going down. The boardroom screens downstairs began flashing alerts, and department heads began texting each other, trying to figure out what had triggered the firestorm back in Miami. One of the reporters who had been tipped off about Naomi's presence tried to snap a photo but was politely blocked by a security guard. A second reporter recognized Naomi immediately, and his face lit up with the hunger of a breaking story. But before he could move forward, a staff member stepped in and handed him a folded statement. Please wait for the official press release, sir. Inside the lounge, Naomi reviewed the names of the crew handed to her by the internal investigator and said quietly, I do not want public executions. I want internal accountability, and I want every single one of these people to understand why they're being removed from service. Not because they failed a passenger, but because they failed a human being. The investigator nodded on. What about the girl, Naomi? Gaze lingered on the name. For a moment. She was 15, she said. Then after a pause, I want her parents contacted. I want them to be made aware that her actions violated federal codes of conduct. In fact, I want to know if this was the first time she has done something like this, and I want her cell phone content legally recovered, but I do not want her dragged through the media. You want the matter settled quietly? No. I want it settled justly. Meanwhile, Alexander's phone would not stop ringing. The VP of Public Relations called 3 times, the head of crisis management twice, and 2 of his legal advisors were already waiting in his office. When he returned from his balcony with a folder in his hand, he dropped the folder onto the table without a word inside. Were screenshots from a video posted just minutes ago, a blurry clip of Naomi sitting silently in her seat, drenched in Coca-Cola. The title of the video was classy. Black woman gets splashed on flight and does nothing. It had gone viral in 20 countries. Stared at it for a long time and then said, release a public statement. Do not name my wife. Do not reference her directly. Simply state that an incident occurred aboard Starway Airlines involving inappropriate behavior toward a passenger of high standing, and that the matter is under urgent executive review. One of the lawyers asked, should we reach out to the girl's parents for a joint apology? Alexander turned his head slowly. You think this is a publicity stunt? I am not looking for headlines. I am looking for transformation. This is not about one girl. It is about a disease we pretend doesn't exist in our service industries. The disease that says when something happens to a black woman, it's entertainment. His voice never rose, but the message burned into the room like fire on glass back. In Miami, the girl and her 2 friends had been separated and brought to different rooms. For questioning, their laughter had faded. Their confidence cracked. The girl who had thrown the drink now sat with her arms crossed, lips trembling, as a federal air marshal explained to her that throwing any object at another passenger could be considered assault, especially at cruising altitude. Especially if targeted. I didn't mean it like that, she mumbled. It was just a joke. The marshal leaned forward. Do you often joke by throwing liquids at strangers? He looked at her lap and said nothing. Her parents had been contacted. They were wealthy lawyers based in New Jersey and were already en route to Miami, but by the time they arrived, legal charges were already being considered back. In the executive suite, Naomi was now changed into fresh clothes, brought to her by a staff member, and sat with her arms resting gently on the table, her mind flashing through the moments of the flight, the look in that girl's eyes, the complete absence of fear or remorse, the shrug of the crew, the smile on the flight attendant's face. She had known that smile her whole life, that same look people gave you when they thought you wouldn't fight back, when they assumed you had no power, no voice, and no backup. But Naomi had backup, and now the system would be forced to change. That night, Naomi returned home to their waterfront estate. In silence, her driver not saying a word as the city lights reflected in the windows. Her fingers pressed against her temples as she tried to quiet the noise. Inside, Alexander was waiting at the front door, and when she stepped out, he didn't say anything, just opened his arms and she walked into them and rested her head against his chest. She whispered, "I'm fine." He whispered, "I know you are, but that doesn't mean I am." They sat outside on the terrace where the ocean whispered against the stone walls, and Naomi finally spoke the words that had been echoing in her head since the flight. "You know what hurts the most," she said. "It's not the girl, it's that everyone else saw it and did nothing." Alexander nodded and replied, "I know that pain too well." She looked at him then and said softly, "I don't want revenge. I want responsibility. You'll have both." She smiled at that, and for the first time since the spill she laughed, a loud laugh, but a real one, the kind that breaks tension like cracking ice. Across the city's screens lit up with breaking news headlines, airline faces, backlash over viral flight video, billionaire's wife targeted in shocking mid-air incident. Airline board called an emergency meeting before sunrise, and by morning flight attendants had been officially suspended pending full investigation. Two airport supervisors were removed from their posts, and the CEO, Richard Vellman, was asked to submit a formal letter of apology directly to Alexander and Naomi Jackson. He did not sleep that night. The internet did not sleep either. The video was shared across platforms, debated on talk shows, dissected in social media forums. Thousands of women wrote messages to Naomi, even without knowing her name, just calling her the woman in 3A, saying they saw her, they stood with her, they had been her. And somewhere in all that chaos, something had shifted, not because she screamed, not because she sued, not because she stood still while the world spun around her and dared to demand better. Every name carries a weight. The next morning, the sun rose on two very different worlds. In one world, flight attendants across the country double-checked their tone, their uniforms, their every movement as news spread. Internally, that Starway Airlines had launched a full-scale internal probe after a private passenger had been targeted mid-air. In the other world, Naomi Jackson sat in her private reading room, wrapped in a grey silk robe, her hair pulled back and her hands resting on a cup of tea she had barely sipped. The night had been restless, but not because of fear or sadness. Her mind had been stitching together every detail, and now she was ready to act. Alexander stood across from her, reading the latest headlines, each one more intense than the last. Billionaire's wife soaked in mid-air attack, airline responds. Flight staff under investigation after shocking video, passenger in business class targeted during flight. The media didn't yet know her name and they hadn't connected her to the Jackson family, but it was only a matter of time, and Alexander was moving ahead faster than the news cycle. He had already ordered that a private board of inquiry be established, one that would bypass standard airline procedures and dig deeper than simple apologies and weak training refreshers. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm and even. "Do you know how many women messaged me last night? Women I've never met, black women, Asian women, even some white women who just felt helpless before." She pulled out her phone and scrolled slowly, showing him screen after screen filled with messages. "They told me stories that made me ache." Alexander, he sat beside her and said, "Then, let's not waste what happened. Let's build something." Later that day, Naomi walked into the Aero Global headquarters through the executive entrance, wearing a navy blue suit and a quiet expression, but every employee who passed her stood a little straighter, not just because they knew who she was, but because something about her presence demanded a kind of attention that couldn't be faked. She entered the executive conference room, where 7 department heads were already seated and waiting. Legal, PR, crisis management training, compliance, HR, and 2 independent advisors from outside firms. Alexander remained in his office, letting her speak for herself, and when Naomi sat down, she looked each person in the eye one by one and said, "I do not want press releases or soft apologies or just culture buzzwords. I want full cultural review." The head of PR nodded nervously and said, "We're preparing a public statement that emphasizes our zero tolerance." Naomi raised one hand, stopping her before she finished. "You have had zero tolerance policies for 20 years, and this still happened. What I want is data. I want names. I want to know how many complaints about racial targeting were made in the last 5 years, how many were resolved, how many were ignored, how many passengers were never heard because they didn't have a powerful husband or a camera or a following." The room went quiet as the gravity of her request landed. Then she added, "And I want the girls' parents, To meet me, not to grovel, not to apologize, but to understand that what she did wasn't just a childish prank, it was a reflection of what she's been taught and what others around her. Allow the head of compliance hesitated and said there may be legal complications with that. Naomi looked at her and replied softly, you let your company put Coca-Cola on my skin, and you're worried about legal complications from a conversation after the meeting. Naomi walked to her husband's office where Alexander was speaking with a board member on speakerphone. When he saw her enter, he gestured for her to sit and placed the call on hold. She looked at him with something new in her eyes, not pain, not anger, but purpose. We're going to build something, aren't we? Alexander nodded yes, and we're going to make it hurt for the right people and heal for the others. Meanwhile, across the city, the teen girl who had thrown the drink now sat in her family's living room in silence, her mother pacing, her father on the phone with their legal counsel. The media had not released her name yet, but someone had leaked that she was underage and from New Jersey, and the internet had already begun putting pieces together. She stared at the television as a commentator said, this isn't just about one bad passenger, this is about a culture that lets people laugh when others are humiliated. Her mother turned to her and asked again, why did you do it? The girl couldn't explain, not really, not in a way that made sense. She had seen Naomi sitting so composed and elegant, and maybe it triggered something. Maybe it was envy, maybe it was a twisted impulse, but in that moment she had thought it would be funny. Now it was anything but. That same day the airline issued a revised statement under pressure from Aero Global Holdings. We deeply regret the incident that occurred aboard flight AG 447, and we are conducting a thorough internal review. The safety and dignity of all our passengers are our highest priorities. Naomi read the statement from her tablet and shook her head, then called the head of communications and said, replace regret with acknowledge, and replace priorities with promises, and while you're at it, remove the phrase internal review, because this is no longer just internal. She hung up and walked into the training department unannounced. Hi, want to see your onboarding videos? She said to the startled director. The woman nodded quickly and pulled up the files on a large screen. Naomi watched in silence the simulated conflict scenarios, the staged customer service smiles, the scripted language that never addressed race or real-world tensions, and when it ended, she turned to the director and asked, where is the training for when a black woman is targeted in business class? The woman looked uncomfortable and replied, we focus on general respect and inclusion. Naomi replied, then, your training is as useless as a parachute on a bus. Later that evening, the teen girl's parents finally agreed to meet Naomi privately. No cameras, no lawyers, no press, just face to face. They met in a quiet hotel conference room where security waited outside, but no one else was present. Naomi entered first, followed by Alexander, who stood in the back without saying a word. Then came the parents, both clearly rattled, the father trying to maintain composure, the mother teary, and the daughter visibly nervous. Naomi looked at her and said, do you remember what you felt in the moment you threw that drink? The girl didn't answer at first, then whispered, I thought it would make people laugh. Naomi's voice remained steady, and now the girl's voice cracked. I feel sick. Good, because shame is the beginning of change. She paused, then leaned forward and said, do you understand why what you did matters beyond you, beyond me? The girl nodded. Naomi looked at the parents and said, I do not hate your daughter, but I do hate the silence that raised her into thinking it was okay to do what she did. Father began to speak, but Naomi raised a hand. I'm not here for your defense. I'm here for your understanding, because you have a chance to raise someone better than the person who sat behind me on that plane, and if you care at all about what happens next, you will not run from this, you will use it after the meeting. Naomi returned to the Jackson estate with a calm heart and a heavier mind. She stepped onto the balcony and looked up at the night sky. Alexander came beside her and whispered, it's starting, isn't it? She nodded. The messages, the calls, the noise, it was all building then. Let it build, she said. Let it crash, let it force a change they'll never forget. The shake-up begins. It started with a single envelope on the desk of Richard Velman, the CEO of Starway Airlines, delivered by hand. No warning, no announcement, no ceremony, just a cream envelope with gold embossing and the initials. AJ pressed into the seal. Richard stared at it for a long time before opening it, his fingers trembling slightly as he slid the thick paper out and read the first line. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your responsibilities as acting CEO, pending full review of internal conduct failures and mishandling of executive-level passenger Grievances signed Alexander Jackson, chairman of Aero Global Holdings. There were no calls, no meetings, no room for protest. It was done by noon. The internal messaging system across the airline lit up with a notice: leadership transition is underway. All team leaders will report directly to interim liaison board until further instruction, and those words sent shockwaves through every branch, every airport, every office. Naomi watched it unfold from her private office, her face composed, but her hands folded tightly across her lap. She had not asked for heads to roll, she had asked for accountability, and this was the beginning. Alexander joined her a few minutes later with a document in hand: 56 formal complaints in the past 2 years, from black and brown passengers treated poorly on Starway flights, and guess how many were resolved? Naomi answered before he could none correct. He said, and most weren't even acknowledged. She took the paper and scanned the list, each line a reflection of silent injustice: names, dates, flight numbers, small stories that had once been ignored, now stacked in black ink. This is our moment, she whispered, not for vengeance, not to flex power, but to pull the whole rotten root out of the ground. Alexander placed a hand on hers and said, then let's dig. The Jacksons called an emergency summit attended by executives across aviation, corporate culture, crisis management, and racial equity. They invited representatives from civil rights groups, airline unions, and even former passengers who had experienced discrimination mid-air. It was not a photo op, it was not a PR stunt, it was a tribunal of truth. The summit began with Naomi standing at the center of a circular hall, her voice echoing through the tall glass chamber. I was not hurt by a drink, I was not broken by silence, I am not shattered by humiliation, I am strengthened by the truth, and it's this the way black women are seen or not seen in spaces of status and service must change, or these spaces will collapse. People did not clap, they listened, they took notes, they nodded in understanding. When it was Alexander's turn to speak, he made it clear, this is not about saving face, this is about setting a new standard, and if any brand under Aero Holdings refuses to meet it, they will not remain under our umbrella. By one, voices joined. The Corsair former pilot stood and recounted how his accent had made passengers treat him like a baggage handler. Even in uniform, a retired flight attendant confessed that she had been told to seat passengers of color near the back during light bookings to avoid white complaints. A current gate agent broke down crying as she described being told not to call security when a passenger was harassed, unless it got violent. Naomi held her hand and whispered, never again. Meanwhile, across the internet, the video of Naomi had reached over 20 million views, but now something had changed. The comments had shifted from mockery to support. People were stitching their own stories next to hers, telling their own versions of being overlooked, laughed at, talked down. The woman in 3A had become a symbol, not because she had reacted loudly, but because she had remained still like a wall, refusing to crack. Hand somewhere in that wave, the teenage girl who had thrown the drink posted her own message, not through a lawyer, not through her parents, just her on her own phone, in her own voice sheet, stared into the lens and said, I did something awful, I thought it was a joke, it wasn't, it was an act of hate, even if I didn't understand it that way at the time, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. She paused, then added, she didn't scream at me, she didn't curse me out, she didn't even try to ruin me, she just let the world see me for what I was, and that hurt more than anything. The video went viral too, but in a different way, and Naomi, when shown the clip, only said, I hope she learns. But the real turning point came when Naomi received a letter from a man named Elijah Cooper, a janitor at a regional airport in Texas. The letter was handwritten and said, I saw the video and I cried, not because of the drink, but because of how calm you stayed, because I get yelled at every day for things I didn't do and I never say anything back, and I thought maybe I was weak, but when I saw you I knew it was strength. Thank you for reminding me. I can be more than silent. Naomi folded the letter slowly and pressed it to her chest. Alexander saw her eyes close and said, this is why you're doing it, isn't it? She nodded for Elijah and every person like him. So they continued. Me personally oversaw the drafting of a new airline training protocol built not from corporate phrases but real-world scenarios, scripted with the help of passengers, crew, diversity experts and legal teams. Every new hire would go through it, every veteran staff member would repeat it annually. The new policy was named the Naomi Standard and core message was simple: see people, respect, presence, dignity is not negotiably. Across the industry, other airlines began reaching out, asking for collaboration, for copies of the material for joint summits. What began as an insult became a movement, but Not everyone celebrated. Some media outlets tried to twist the story, painting Naomi as overreacting, calling the response disproportionate, as criticized the firing of Richard Veltman, saying it sent a chilling message to executives everywhere. Naomi read those articles and said nothing because she knew what they did. That silence only protects the comfortable, and discomfort is the first step toward growth. That night, Naomi and Alexander sat beneath the stars once more, sipping tea and listening to the wind. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. He answered, "I think if we keep pushing it, will." She looked out at the horizon and whispered, "Then let's keep pushing, because the girl in row 16 may have thrown a drink, but the world finally saw the stain, and now they had no choice but to clean it. The ripple becomes a wave." Naomi never intended to become a movement, but the world had already made that decision for her. What started as one flight, one drink, one smirk, and one silence had now unfolded into a global conversation about dignity, power, and the cost of ignoring the quiet pain of those who never had anyone behind them. Now they had her phone buzzed non-stop with requests, interviews, speeches, invitations from universities, political groups, airlines, charities, all wanting her voice, her presence, her story. But Naomi didn't want to be a brand. She wanted to be the reason policies changed, not temporarily, not for news cycles, but permanently, with roots deep enough to outlive her. 1 week after the incident, a conference was held in Washington, D.C., titled Skybound Dignity, organized jointly by Aero Global and national transportation authorities, and Naomi was asked to deliver the keynote speech. She stood on the wide stage beneath the bright white lights, wearing a deep green dress, no jewelry, no frills, just her and the microphone. The room was silent as she began. "I did not come here to tell you a sad story. I came here to tell you a real one. I came here as the woman in seat 3A, but more than that. I came as every woman who has been dismissed while dressed in strength, every person who has swallowed their scream, just to make others feel comfortable." The screen behind her lit up with images, not of her, but of letters she had received in the past week from janitors, nurses, young mothers, retired pilots, students, every walk of life. Naomi continued, "I have read each word, I have cried with each name, and what I've learned is simple. People are not asking to be worshipped, they are asking to be signed." She shared a story of a woman named Grace who had been refused access to the first-class bathroom during a flight despite holding a first-class ticket. She shared the message of a blind man named Devon who was told to sit quietly while a flight attendant explained to others how to assist him, as if he wasn't there. She finished with the words, "This is not about race only or class only. This is about the culture of invisibility, and the cost of it can no longer be paid in silence." The room stood as one and clapped, not because she had made them feel good, but because she had made them feel responsibly. Across the media, Naomi's words were played on repeat, and suddenly every company, not just airlines, started auditing their policies, looking at their training models, and questioning who their systems had been designed to protect. Back at Aero Global, Alexander was reviewing the early results of their new Naomi Standard implementation reports from several regional hubs showed a 50% drop in conflict complaints within the first few days, and passenger satisfaction had spiked by an astonishing 37%, not because flights were smoother, but because people felt heard. Meanwhile, the teenage girl who had thrown the drink remained in counseling, part of a court-mandated restorative justice program, not punishment but education. She met weekly with a group of peers from different races and backgrounds. She listened, she admitted, and she slowly began to shift her own narrative. She even volunteered to film a segment for a youth anti-bullying campaign, not as a hero but as a warning. Naomi received a message from the girl through the program director. "It said, I know you may not want to hear from me, and I understand that, but I wanted to say thank you for not turning me into a hashtag or a headline. Thank you for showing me that staying silent takes more courage than screaming, and I hope one day I become someone worth respecting." Naomi read it quietly, then deleted it, not out of anger, but because she believed the girl's next actions would matter more than her words. Weeks passed and change began to settle. Like a new layer of paint over an old wall, the stains were still underneath, but something brighter was starting to One morning, Naomi visited the airport where her flight had landed. She didn't go to the VIP lounge or the executive floors. She went to the check-in counters, to the gate waiting areas, to the staff rooms. She spoke to employees, asked them what they needed, what training they wished they had, what treatment they hoped to receive. She listened. One gate agent named Tasha told her, "Sometimes I wish they knew how scared we are when Things go wrong, like if I say the wrong thing to the wrong person, I could lose my job, but if I say nothing, someone like you gets hurt, and I just freeze." Naomi took her hand and said, "Then let's build you a bridge. That doesn't make you choose between your job and your soul." That same day, she requested the creation of a new department called Human Balance, a hybrid of HR, mental health and ethics, staffed with counselors and real advocates who would serve not just passengers but the employees themselves. For the first time, flight attendants had a space to report racism from passengers without fear of discipline for making a scene, and passengers had a team they could speak to mid-flight through a new app quietly, safely, and directly. Everything Naomi created was designed not for headlines but for healing at home. Alexander watched her with quiet awe. He had known she was strong, but watching her rebuild the air around her from pain into purpose was something even he could not have imagined. Brought her tea one night and said, "You know, you've become the storm now." She smiled softly and said, "Not a storm, a current, and the ones who don't change will drown in it." But not everyone supported the changes. Some investors complained that all these reforms cost too much. Some executives feared that Naomi's influence would alienate traditional customers, and some media voices tried to frame the entire movement as elite drama. Naomi addressed them only once during an internal call. She said, "If treating people like people threatens your bottom line, then your business deserves to fail." And with that, she moved forward. The woman in 3A had once been just a passenger, but now she was the pulse of something larger, and she wasn't done yet. The seat she left behind. Months passed since that flight, and the world had not forgotten the woman in seat 3. Naomi Jackson had become more than a name, more than a symbol. She had become a force of redesign in places where silence once ruled. In boardrooms, in training halls, in flight cabins, and crew lounges, her presence echoed not as noise but as a standard that could no longer be ignored. She no longer had to speak loudly. Her story had already been written into new company policies. Her face had never been printed on a poster, but her actions had carved deep marks into the foundation of how people were now being treated in the sky above and on the ground below. The Naomi Standard had officially launched in 6 countries and was already adopted by 4 other major airlines and 1 private luxury train company that had quietly requested her help. After internal audits revealed more than discomfort, they revealed complicity and cover-up and habitual silence. But Naomi never bragged. She never gave herself to the camera. She remained focused, grounded, and purposeful. She still read letters every evening, handwritten notes sent from people who saw themselves in her strength or had learned something from her stillness. One afternoon, she received a letter from a retired flight attendant named Carol, who had served for over 20 years and had walked away from her job 2 years ago after being told she should stop being so sensitive when she cried. After witnessing a young girl be humiliated on a flight, Carol's letter read, "I thought walking away meant I was weak, but now I see that staying silent would have been the true weakness. Thank you for making it feel like I was not alone. Thank you for changing the rules." Naomi folded the letter and placed it inside a wooden box on her shelf that held the most powerful stories. One morning, Naomi was invited back to the very airport where it all began to attend a quiet ceremony where the gate leading to her original flight had been renamed Gate Jackson, not for fame, not for noise, but to quietly remind every traveler and every worker that dignity begins at the gate before the wheels ever leave the ground. As she walked through that terminal, the staff lined up on both sides, not in a parade, not in a performance, but in quiet respect, heads nodding, eyes meeting hers, hands held over hearts, not as obligation, but as gratitude. When Naomi entered the gate, she was greeted by a young black woman working the counter who smiled nervously and said, "I just wanted to say thank you because I used to think people like us had to take it to survive, and now I know we don't." Naomi touched her hand gently and said, "We don't." Ever again. A few feet away, Seat 3A was roped off on display for the ceremony, not to glorify the past, but to mark the change. And after the event, Naomi asked for the seat to be taken down and quietly donated to a civil rights museum where stories of unspoken battles were displayed. The months turned to a year. The ripple she caused became a tide that reshaped company cultures, challenged industries, and awakened the quiet voices of millions. She never asked for revenge, and she never wanted praise. She simply wanted the seat she sat in to mean something more than a number on a ticket. She wanted the silence that followed the splash to be the last of its kind, and in many ways it was Naomi returned home that evening to her husband waiting by the garden with warm tea and quiet music. She sat beside him on the bench overlooking the ocean, and he asked her one final question: "Do you think we changed the world?" She smiled and answered, "No, we reminded it to feel stagnant." In the distance the waves whispered like a calm new beginning, the end.